welcome to the Nobel Prize Museum and this Teachers Online Seminar. So we're here at the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, but we also have a lot of teachers following us online from all over the world. So I know that we have friends in Bangladesh, in Colombia, in England, and many other places also. So today's theme is crisis economy. And we're going to talk about how we teach about that. I'm Annika Hedås-Falk. I was before a teacher, and we have a group here at the museum who works with education and teacher training activities and so on. And usually we have a full museum of 100 teachers here, but today we have a very small group of teachers because of the coronavirus, but all of you can follow us online, so we're really happy to have you all here. The Nobel Prize really shows that good ideas and hard work and cooperation really can change the world, and this museum was built upon those ideas. The Nobel Prize was founded by Alfred Nobel, a Swedish inventor. I think you all know him. He invented dynamite, but also a lot of other things. I think my favorite quote from Alfred Nobel is that he says that if I have 300 ideas in 1 year and just one of them turns out to be good, then I'm happy. And that's what we want to share here at this museum, the inspiration and all the good things that the Nobel laureates have done for humanity. And we want to learn from history to really have an impact on our future. So that's what we try to do here. And today's theme is crisis economy, and we have some great speakers here today. We have Lena Hensvik, John Hassler, and Lars Heikensten. And if you follow us online, you can also participate by sending in questions. At the end of the show, we will have a panel here with all the speakers on stage, so you can ask your questions to them. So please send in questions at nobelprizemuseum.se/questions, so we can feel that you are with us. And this pandemic has forced teachers also to teach in a whole different way. And it has affected so many parts of our world. And this is my friend Kimberly from the US. She's teaching her students wearing full mask. And my friend Truong from Vietnam, he sent me this picture of a corona-safe hug, because the students really wanted to hug each other when they met again when the school opened. And this is also my friend from Tanzania that sent me this picture, and students wearing masks. So it's been a lot of challenges this year, and the economy affects us all, and unemployment affects so many people. And how are we going to teach about these really complicated questions? That's why we asked our experts to come and talk to us. And our first speaker is Lena Hensvik. Oh, sorry. She's a professor of economics, and she's going to talk about the impact of the Swedish labor market. And give a warm hand to Lena Hensvik. So I'm going to see if I can get your slideshow working. Yes. How did we do this now? See. Just wait, yeah. Okay, it works. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. First time in this museum, so that's great. I'm going to have a walk later and have a look at the museum. So I will talk today about the impact of this crisis on the Swedish labor market. And I think a particular focus in my presentation will be more on how it will affect or has affected particular groups and income inequality in the labor market. I think John will talk more about sort of the aggregate impacts of the crisis So I will just start by giving you a brief background on the situation of the Swedish labor market prior to the outbreak. So I was part in a project a few years ago where we took sort of a quite deep look at the situation on the Swedish labor market. And we came to the conclusion that the Swedish labor market is strong from an international perspective. We have very high labor force participation in Sweden, high employment rate, and fairly low unemployment rate, at least at the European average. We also have high minimum wages in Sweden, meaning that wage dispersion in the labor market is quite low in international comparison. So given that you work, people earn quite high wages. Another significant feature of the labor market, which may be important in this current situation, is that we have very few low qualified jobs compared to other countries. So in fact, we have the lowest fraction of low qualified jobs in Europe. But overall, if you're kind of the average worker on the Swedish labor market, you're doing fairly well prior to the crisis. However, we also saw that there were some structural challenges in the labor market, mainly pertaining to increasing income inequality over time. And as I just said before, we have low wage dispersion, but when we look at actual income dispersion, the incomes that people receive, we do see increasing income inequality. And the important margin here is employment. So what we do see in terms of increasing income inequality is an increasing difference between those who have a job and those who are non-employed. These problems are also concentrated to certain groups. So we could identify fairly easily certain groups that fare worse in the labor market. In particular, these are recent immigrants, youth, and in particular youths who failed in the education system. So for the average young person, even though they have quite high unemployment rates, they have very short unemployment spells. But if we look at the youths who failed their high school education, we do see much more that they suffer more in terms of have higher difficulties of entering the labor market. We can also see that older unemployed people, those who lose their jobs at a higher age, are experiencing difficulties of returning to work. So we saw that there are quite high obstacles in entering and re-entering the labor market. The current crisis may potentially increase these differences and enhance income inequality on the Swedish labor market. It is, of course, still, I would say, very early to say for certain what is going to happen. We're still in the middle of the pandemic, I would say. And we're also in a stage where you have a lot of kind of temporary solutions in place in terms of labor market policy. So we have, for example, a short-time work schedule that may change over time, and even if you do sort of cross-country comparisons, it's also difficult at this stage to compare numbers because we have very different temporary systems in place. But despite that, I think one could speculate at least that we might worry that the crisis will sort of increase the inequality in the labor market. Why is that? Well, as you might know, Sweden, the policy response in Sweden in terms of the social distancing restrictions has been less severe or milder than in other countries, and mainly they have been based on sort of voluntary compliance with guidelines to keep social distance and to remain at home if you experience flu-like symptoms and so on. But sort of businesses, restaurants, shops and so on have remained open as long as they comply with these guidelines. Despite that, and I think which reflects that Swedish people actually complied with these guidelines. We do see a very rapid and massive contraction on the labor market. So the number of new vacancies at the public employment service decreased only within a few months by around 40%. We did see a really fast increase in the number of unemployed people. Many workers were put on this short-time work schedule, and we also saw a huge increase in the number of layoffs, whereas the increase in the number of bankruptcies have been less severe. So this graph just shows the drop in the new incoming vacancies at the public employment service. So on the x-axis here you have weeks, and then on the y-axis you see the average daily inflow of new vacancies at the public employment service. So you see the solid line is for this year and the dashed line for 2019. And as you can see, those two lines follow each other very well up until week 11, which is the week when the public health agency issued the recommendations about social distancing. After that, you see a very drastic drop in the number of incoming vacancies, suggesting that sort of labor demand has been severely affected by this crisis, and the drop here, as I said before, corresponds to about 40%. So why do we think that sort of the current crisis might increase income inequality, and that it might potentially be different than other previous crises? Well, the obvious sort of mechanical relationship, which is not very strange, is of course that increased non-employment at the rates that we see right now lead to increased income dispersion. But one might also bear in mind that increased non-employment today means a greater income dispersion today than the same levels of unemployment, say, 20 years ago. Why is that? That is because we have had a very strong development or increase in real wages on the labor market, whereas the transfers to the non-employed from, for example, the UI system have increased at a lower pace. So the difference between the income that you receive if you have a low paid job in Sweden compared to if you are on unemployment benefits is greater today than it was before. So that means that if this crisis results in sort of a permanently higher level of unemployment, that in itself will lead to increased income dispersion. Then research also shows that weakly attached workers are more heavily affected by downturns. So new hires, workers that are on short-time contracts or temporary contracts, and labor market entrants are typically those who first lose their jobs or have difficulties of even entering the labor market in a recession. So when I talk about labor market entrants, you can think about young people, you can think about newly arrived immigrants, and there is sort of a large body of research showing that young people, for example, that are forced to enter the labor market in bad conditions fare relatively worse than those who enter the labor market in good conditions, and not only in the short term, but you also see sort of in the long-term perspective that their incomes are lower even, say, 15 years after labor market entry. The same is also evident if you look at newly arrived immigrants, depending on when they arrived to Sweden, whether they arrived during good times or bad times, you see differences in the long run, in their long run outcomes. So we may worry about those cohorts that enter the labor market at this very point in time. One might also perhaps speculate that the very nature of the current crisis may reinforce this pattern. So one significant feature of this crisis compared to, say, previous crises is that the response on the labor market is very asymmetric. So some sectors and occupations have been much more heavily affected, which reflects that these social distancing guidelines affects the product market very differently. So we do see the largest effects in hotels, restaurants, retail trade, and so on. These are also those sectors where you typically find the low-skilled entry-level jobs. So these sectors tend to offer sort of the entry into the labor market for groups that are inexperienced, so for young workers, for immigrants, and so on. This is very different compared to what we saw, for example, during the financial crisis, when the sectors most heavily affected was primarily within manufacturing, where we do not find as many of these marginal workers. So from that we might worry that we already were in a situation prior to the crisis where we had a fairly low fraction of these low-skilled jobs, and this crisis has further sort of affected these types of jobs. Then the policy measures that have been put in place during the spring, for example, the most prominent one, the short-time work schedule, where has been targeted at protecting existing jobs. So of course the crisis packages have been sort of aimed at protecting firms and jobs, but less focus has been put on sort of providing opportunities for the entering groups. I think a third worry that we might have is that the quality of the assistance that we actually give to the job seekers that have been unemployed, the quality of that may be hurt during the crisis. So the very nature of the fact that we cannot sort of meet within the unemployment offices, we need to keep social distance. We cannot meet in schools, for example, or in high schools at least, and universities during the spring, may lead to deteriorating quality. So for example, the sort of monitoring of the job seekers and the help to the job seekers were temporarily paused during the spring because the Public Employment Service did not obviously want a lot of people in the offices. That if that kind of help is important in supporting the job seekers, this might have important effects. Also because we know that the longer you have been unemployed, the more difficult is it to re-enter the labor market. We might also, as I said before, worry, so if we look at young people, we do see that those who fail their high school education are the ones that are at risk of also failing in the labor market, so to say. And the fact that high school moved online could mean that some marginal students who are already struggling to actually complete their high school education will not be able to do so anymore. So this just shows the fraction of new registrations at the Public Employment Service and how it has increased between 2019 and 2020 for different groups. And here we see that and it's for different age groups. So to the left here, you have the younger age groups, and to the right, the older ones. And what you see is that for the youngest age group, you do see an inflow into unemployment that is around 60% higher than compared to last year. Whereas this change is not as strong for sort of the older group. So it seems as if the young people have been particularly hurt so far. But as I said before, this should be taken with a grain of salt because we still, I think, don't have all the right measures to do these kind of comparisons. So finally, I just would like to say something about what can be done in terms of trying to mitigate these impacts on wage dispersion and for the most harmed groups. When I was doing this project a few years ago that I mentioned, we sort of came with a number of policy suggestions to sort of lower the entry barriers for these groups that experience particular difficulties. And I think many of these policy suggestions also are also relevant during this crisis. So we know, for example, from research that employment subsidies, such as payroll tax cuts, or subsidized employment is a powerful way to assist marginal groups into employment. So the typical problem is usually that the firms don't use these subsidies as much as we would like. So I think that getting these into place and sort of promoting firms to use this more would be a fruitful policy. We now have recently seen that the government launched that they will cut the payroll tax for young people. And normally, I think we as economists are quite skeptical towards such general payroll tax cuts, because what it means is that it will subsidize young people that would have gained employment anyways, and it will just be a subsidy to the industries that employ many young people. And ideally, we would like to target those payroll tax cuts even more towards those young people that actually have problems. But I think in this case, during this particular crisis, it might be a sort of a well-targeted policy to actually do cut payroll tax, at least temporarily, for young workers, because that will sort of direct the money to those industries that employ many young people, and those are also those who have been most heavily affected by this crisis. I think in terms of sort of strengthening the skills of the entering of the workers, recessions are usually a good time to really invest in education, because the probability to get the job finding rate is quite low. And overall, we know that at least for older workers, it is wise to have education policy that kind of are short in nature and that include, importantly, interactions with employers. When we think about young workers, we can think about a bit longer education, so expanding university slots could be a wise policy, but it's important that sort of the way it's done is in a way that also corresponds to the demands of the labor market. There is a risk in recessions when sort of firms are already struggling that you sort of scale down the contacts with employers in the education system. But I would say that from research, we know that these employer contacts are really, really important. In particular for young workers who don't have a lot of experience, it's important to have sort of trainee ships and different forms of interactions with employers to that will be have high returns in getting these young workers back into the labor market. So I think this is what my main presentation. Just to sum up, I would just say that, you know, I think it's still quite early, but I think it's important that we now think about how this could impact inequality and how we should target the measures in order to really help those groups that will be most heavily affected by the crisis.
Lena Hensvik, thank you. And we will be able to ask questions to you, I think, at the end of the program in the panel. All right. Thank you so much. So I think this is highly relevant to us as teachers, both when it comes to explain those things in class, but also because we work with young people and they are so affected by this non-inclusive job market if we don't succeed in those measures. So thank you so much, Lena. So imagine that you get a call from Stockholm somebody who tells you that you have won the Nobel Prize. This is happening to people every year, like between 10 and 15 people receive this call. And many of them say, well, this must be a joke or something, and they ask to call back and so on. So the announcement week, this is like Christmas Eve for us who work with the Nobel Prize. And it's just coming up in a few weeks' time. And when I was a teacher, I was teaching music and literature, Swedish literature and language. And I always, this was the last century. So we didn't have any internet. So I made a lesson about the literature laureate based on the newspaper that morning. And that was a really bad lesson, but I felt that I wanted to teach about it immediately. And now, since I started working here, we have actually created a lesson material for you that is released on our website 24 hours after every announcement in all these 6 prize categories. So 24 hours after this, you can download this for free. And it's a slideshow, it's a student worksheet, it's a short video with somebody explaining the prize, and also a teacher's manual, and so it's easy for you to use. And we call it the Nobel Prize Lessons, and it's available in both English and Swedish. So the Economy Prize was not one of the original 5 prizes that Alfred Nobel established. It was founded over 50 years ago, and it was the celebration of the Swedish National Bank that turned 300 years at the time. So it was a big celebration, and they had a donation to found the Economics Prize in the memory of Alfred Nobel. And last year, the prize was about how to fight poverty in new ways. And the laureates that got the prize last year, they have done more an experimental approach to how to fight poverty. And one of the things that they saw very much, of course, that poverty is a huge problem that affects all the world, of course, but also they were doing studies on education. And since we have this international network of teachers, I have had the privilege to travel around and visit schools in many different countries, both, of course, here in Sweden when I was a teacher and a principal. I've visited many classrooms here, and I've been to India and to Tanzania and many different countries. So, and I have seen the exact same problem both here in Sweden, in the US, in poor countries, and everywhere, the balance to teach at the right level, because it is so hard. And this is something that the Nobel laureates also saw, that it's a huge problem that we teach to the students things that they cannot understand really. So improving schools is a super important way. And that's also shown in the 17 sustainability global goals also, education as a key. So Esther Duflo, one of the laureates of last year, she said the problems is not the textbooks, the problem is that the children are taught something which is much, much too far for them to understand. So also an economics prize can be super relevant to us as teachers. And if you want to join the teacher network, you can sign up on our website, and then you'll get information directly to your email about those new prizes coming up in just 1.5 weeks. So every day you can get a new lesson material. That's nice, right? Okay, our next speaker, he is a professor in macroeconomy, And in Sweden, we see him quite often on TV when he is talking about economics and how it affects society in different ways. He's here to speak about how the coronavirus affected our economies and what should be done about it. So give a warm hand to John Hassler.
Thank you very much, Annika. You spoke about making the call to the laureates, and I've been in the prize committee for 10 years, so we do a lot of work during the year, but it's very rewarding, and the big reward is to make that call and say, you have received the prize.
Yeah, do you already today know who is going to get the prize?
Of course.
Can I get some first-hand information just for me?
12th of October.
Okay. We're going to have to wait until then.
And once actually, when the committee called to find the laureate was actually teaching. And the committee tried to get the secretary to pick him up, but she said no, under no circumstances can we pick him up from teaching. That's the most important, and no one can disturb him. So we had to wait until the class was over, and I think it reflects that we all understand that teaching is extremely important. Economists want to put numbers on things, and sometimes maybe it's not well advised, but sometimes it is. And I just made a little back of the envelope calculation of how valuable the investment is that is done in school. And people like Lena and colleagues have kind of calculated how much income extra you get if you spend another year in school. So we have a quite good idea about that. And if you kind of sum all the extra income that you get from studying an extra year, you get a number like 1 million crown per student and year that is produced in human capital, or 100,000 euros. So that's you should have that with you in that you actually produce things that are extremely valuable. So 1 million crown per student and year. And together with the students, of course. So I'm going to speak about the kind of the macroeconomic aspects of the corona crisis. And first we need to think about what kind of crisis this is. And one obvious feature is, of course, that it's extremely large and synchronized all over the world. It happened, within months everywhere in the world. And as long as we have done national accounting, which started after the Great Depression in the US, we haven't seen anything like this. Another important feature is that we know what the direct cause is. Sometimes, most of the time when we see big recessions, we don't really know exactly what it is. Maybe we can point to some triggering things, but the main reason remains often kind of a bit unknown. Here we know exactly what it is. It is that we need to do social distancing. And that implies that some goods and services can no longer be produced or consumed, or they have to be produced or consumed in slightly different ways with having less of interaction. People have to work from home, maybe bring home restaurant food instead of eating in the restaurant, and so on. And some things have to be closed down entirely. And another important thing is that this has led to disruptions in what we call supply chains. So we have here in Sweden truck manufacturers, and when they didn't get the supplies of some critical components for the trucks from China, which was a little bit ahead of us, as you know, in terms of the dynamics of the crisis, that made it impossible to produce for some time. So these are the things that we know, and what we should, I think it's important also to know that these changing in kind of the production and consumption of stuff, that's affected by regulation. Some countries have closed down their economies, but also to a very large extent through voluntary changes in behavior. And some of my colleagues have studied that in the US, so they have a data set containing a couple of 100 million cell phones. So they know where this cell phone is every point in time, and they can connect it to credit card data. That sounds a little spooky or scary, but that's I guess it's kind of anonymous. So they can see at least what the holder of this cell phone did at different points in time if he went to the shopping mall, to the restaurants, and so on, and they can connect that to spending on these things. And what they then find is that the lockdown measures that were done in different points in time in different counties in the US, they had impacts on, how often you went to the shopping mall and spent money there. But compared to the voluntary changes that happened before the lockdown and after, a couple of weeks before and after, the lockdown was relatively small. So voluntary changes are very large, and Lena mentioned that also happened in Sweden. So I want to talk a little bit about what to do with this with this crisis, and I'm going to focus entirely on the economic policies. So I'm not an expert at all about whether it's a good idea to close schools or what you should do from an epidemiological point of view, but I know a little bit at least of the economics. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So let's first say a few words about standard recession policy. And sometimes we get into recessions, and it's important to know that how we economists think about the economy, and for good reasons, is that in the short run, over say half a year, or a couple of years, what the production or the GDP or the income generated are to a large extent determined by how much is demanded. So if people stop consuming or stop investing or do less of it at least, also production and income goes down. It's important to note that this is in the short run. Poor countries are not poor because they have too little demand, of course. That's very other different. But in the short run, and the things that cause recessions, changes in demand are very important for standard recessions. I'm going to come to later that this recession is quite different. And then sometimes, as I said, demand is not sufficient, and then for different reasons, people get worried or don't want to consume and so on, and this causes a reduction in GDP and income. And then what the government can do is to try to if the demand is insufficient, you can stimulate that by giving people more money. The government consumes itself, or you reduce taxes, or whatever. And that's the standard recipe. But this is not a good recipe today, because at least not against the direct effects of the corona crisis, that people don't consume travel services, restaurant services, and so on. That's what we want, right? So even if this has negative impacts on income, we cannot undo that by stimulating consumption in these areas. And this is very important. So what should we do instead then? Well, I think policy should have, and largely has had, three central goals. And the first one, and probably most important, is to short-circuit feedback mechanism in the economy that can create a great recession or even a depression from an initial change in income. So a shock happens to the economy, like the corona. This can trigger a lot of amplification mechanisms that can really cause really serious damage to the economy. And often these go via financial markets. Stock market falls, maybe house prices falls. That leads to difficulties for individuals and firms to borrow. This amplifies the fall in asset prices and a reduction in economic activity and GDP and so on. Then perhaps banks start to get problems. They start to distrust each other, so the whole banking system stops functioning. And that can really create enormous damage. And this was what happened during the recession in the 30s, which was terrible. So shortcutting these things is very important to make sure that these strengthening or feedback mechanisms that amplify the direct effect that we can't really do much about, that these feedback mechanisms don't operate. So this is the most important thing. The second thing is to prevent that the crisis don't lead to long-run damages to the economy. And here, a way of thinking of it is that the economy, when we produce stuff and so on, and have economic activity, we need machines and we need infrastructure and we need people and human capital and so on. Another thing that we need is what we sometimes call relational capital, and that is links between individuals, employees on the one hand, and firms on the other hand. That link is important. We don't work anonymously. We need to work in a firm. There are links between firms and consumers, links between supply chains, between one firm that supplies to another and so on. And all these links, these relations, are absolutely necessary for our economy to work. Without it, it doesn't work. And if these links are broken, it takes time to rebuild them. It takes time for a new firm to start up and get relations with the customers. It takes time for an employee that loses her job to find a new job and so on. So what we want to do to prevent the crisis from having long-run damage effects is to try to reduce the amount of these links that are broken, and then it boils down to minimizing layoffs and minimizing bankruptcies. Then a third, also very important thing is to note that these kind of reductions in some activities that we need to do, they are very unevenly spread, and the income effects of them are very unevenly spread. I, for example, haven't taken a hit at all, and others have not either, but some have. And to redistribute these changes in income in a fair way is, of course, very important. And here I think it's important to note that the thing of kind of minimizing layoffs, helping firms to survive, not go into bankruptcy, that's maybe not such a good idea in normal times, because an important part of that we become better and having higher incomes and so on is that bad firms are going bankrupt and are replaced by good ones. But now kind of firms go bankrupt not because they are bad, but because of a temporary shock to income due to the corona, and that's not good. So we want to make sure that we kind of try to satisfy the second goal, but not do it, but do it only during the crisis. One thing that you sometimes hear is that a crisis is like a cleansing, has a cleansing effect, that it's typically the kind of the firms that don't really are going to survive in the long run and have low productivity, they are the ones hit. I argue that that's not the case in this case, and actually not usually either. There's research showing that during the financial crisis, it was not kind of the highly productive and fast-growing firms that had problems. No, sorry, it was those that had problems, and not the ones that you really wanted to clean out. So the cleansing effect of a crisis is probably not strong, and it's more about helping firms, which you typically don't want to do in normal times, but now. So what happened? We have had huge falls in GDP in the second quarter relative to, for example, the second quarter last year. In Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, 5%, 6%, 7% down in income. It's a little bit larger in some of the other European countries, and countries like Italy, France have been particularly hit because they have a lot of tourist industry that really was affected much more than many other sectors by the voluntary and regulated changes in behavior, social distancing. UK, they have many problems, and maybe some of them manifested themselves here. They also had a lot of reduction in GDP. EU as a whole, 14%. US, about the same thing. Brazil too. India, quite a large fall. And China, a little bit less. We can also see that there's been about an equally large reduction in the number of worked hours, which is not surprising, of course. But I would nevertheless say that although these dips in GDP and income are very large, they are smaller actually than what I expected in the beginning of the crisis. When I was told that we are going to see kind of strong lockdowns, large share of the population working from home, closing down of lots of stuff, closing borders and so. And then despite doing that, in many of these countries, 95% of income and GDP is still there. That's surprising, I think. So perhaps our globalized economies are more robust than we thought. And sometimes I argue that I think that we live in a world where at least the Western economies are more robust than to these kinds of shock than we ever have seen. Has the economic policy worked? I said these goals, and in particular the first one was important to kind of make sure that you don't get this amplification mechanism via the financial markets. We saw some elements of that happening in the beginning. The stock market fell. People started getting worried that the financial markets didn't want to kind of hold risky assets. So there was a clear signal that we might go into something that could lead to the banking crisis and perhaps even a depression. But thanks to very swift and strong actions from, in particular, the central banks, we didn't see those mechanisms. So what the central banks basically did is to say that if you are worried about, they said to people acting on the financial markets, if you are worried about the things you hold, come to us and we'll give you money instead. So we buy it and give you money. And since nowadays, people have good trust in most economies for the value of money. We don't think that it's going to be inflated away. Then the people were happy with that. Yes, they said, okay. And actually it was even enough to give that promise. Then people said that, okay, but I know that I have that backdoor if it gets bad. And then that led to the stock market coming back. Asset prices didn't fall until, except for the initial drop, but then came back, and we didn't see much of a change in housing prices, for example. So this was the important thing, not interest rate cuts. That couldn't be done because it was already zero or even negative. As I said, the number of hours have gone down, but reduction in employment is much smaller. In EU, hours worked has gone down by 11%, but the number of employees has not gone down much. And in Sweden, for example, the number of employed full-time employees has gone down by 0.7%, despite hours going down by 10%. So people don't work as many hours, or not at all, but they keep the employment, and that's very important. In the US, it's very different. On the other hand, maybe it kind of it's easier for those who lose the job in the US to find a new one, but it's going to take some time. So I think the European policy here is better. Try to make sure that employment contracts are not broken. We haven't seen, at least yet, any flood wave of bankruptcies. It's up a little bit, in particular in the affected service industries, but not much yet. So far, it seems like the policies have worked pretty well, not undoing the direct effect of social distancing. That cannot be done. But the other things, namely the amplification mechanism and the long-run damages, we haven't seen yet. But it's not over, of course. So let me end by some expectations and hopes. I'm not a good forecaster. I often mix together my forecast with my hopes, and that's kind of the number one no for any forecaster. But so you have to bear with you that maybe these are a little bit optimistic. But anyway, I think we can nevertheless see some indications that our economies are coming back. But clearly, we also see other indications that maybe we have to be a little bit tougher, both in our individual changes in behavior and regulation when it comes to kind of preventing the second waves or third waves and so on. I also hope that we will keep these bridging policies so that we don't get bankruptcies and layoffs too much. But on the other hand, you know, many firms are now quite vulnerable, and it doesn't take so much for them to go back to go bankrupt. So policymakers need really to be on their toes to prevent that. Same thing, of course, with the central bank that is very important not to trigger amplification mechanism from the financial markets. Another thing that we, at least in Sweden, and I think in many other countries, have not done sufficiently well, is to think about what we can do with all this reduction, these hours that are now not used in working in your regular field if you are in affected industries. So as you know, in many countries, including Sweden, we have policies that subsidize short-term work. And that means that a lot of time is done without working, but you should use it for something good. I sometimes have said that the crisis, you know, not thinking about the terrible health consequences is like having an involuntary vacation for some people. But you know, you shouldn't lie in your hängmatta in Swedish, but in your bed, or you know, be idle completely for a very long vacation. You should do something with it. So we should try to spend these hours or this time for education, for kind of improving your abilities, maybe to educate trainees and so on. And that's done too little. And I think if this crisis continues, we need to do more of it. Another thing that I think we have seen too much about in Sweden, at least, actually in the EU too, is kind of people use the crisis as an argument for their favorite policy. They say that now is the right time to do lots of other things. And I think I don't like that much. I think the crisis calls for very special things, very special measures that we shouldn't do later on. So now focus on that. And that goes, for example, also for my favorite research area where I do most of my research, climate change, where I think that the best thing you can do for the climate is actually to make sure that we don't go into a depression. So focus on that now, and then we'll deal with the long run issues later. I said that crisis is not a good time for creative destruction, so that kind of cleansing effect. One thing that is a little bit of a worry is that many of these policies that governments have done are costly. You need to spend a lot of money, and that means that you need to borrow. Sweden is fortunate in the sense that we don't have any problems with borrowing, but some other countries have. And if you get kind of a worry that governments are not going to pay back their debt or not be able to do it, that can also create like a self-amplifying mechanism that could lead to bad outcomes. So that is a little bit of a thing to worry. And then my final word is that I hope that we can kind of come back to international coordination and cooperation. That really kind of was breaking down during at least the initial parts of the crisis, which I guess is natural, but you kind of want to close the doors when you see a big virus coming. But now it's time to go back to international coordination and cooperation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. So we will be able to ask you questions at the end of this program. And I was really happy, both when you said that teachers are so important and also that we are adding a great value to the world. And also I think it was really nice hearing that you said that choosing between hope and expectations, you might lean into hope more. So I think that's a good thing. This museum is built upon the stories of the Nobel laureates, and it is about the Nobel Prizes. And this is an online seminar for teachers, and we are talking about the economic crisis in following the pandemic that we're actually in right now. So every year when the Nobel laureates come to Stockholm to collect the prizes here, we ask them to bring something to the museum. And they are like, what kind of object? And we said, any object. So bring something that means something to you, and we will use it to tell your stories. And they have brought so fantastic and crazy things. And you have to come here. It's a treasure trove, and you can find so many strange things here at the museum. And my colleague Pontus will now take you on a small, short tour of the museum. So Pontus, are you ready?
Okay, so I'm here at another part of the museum, and this part is called the gallery. And here collect artifacts from the laureates. And every year, a couple of days before the 10th, the laureates come here to the museum foundation because it's here approximately 4 days. And 4 days are very tight. Most of the time, because most of the time the physics laureates have never talked to literature laureates. So what a lunch and a couple of hours for the laureates to calm down and talk to each other without the media attending. And it's kind of interesting, of course, to see their about, of course, and it's fun to see them in a more. Most of the time, they're pretty nervous because you could tell that this is a very big event for them and a big evening, of course. So what the Nobel Foundation do is they go through the week and talk about the prize ceremony and the banquet and what's going to happen and stuff like that. And the laureates get time to ask questions about the banquet and about the prize ceremony and stuff like that. So what we also do is ask the laureates to give us at the museum some artifact or a thing that we can show about. So I will give you some examples, and what you see around us is a lot of artifacts from laureates. So I will bicycle. The bicycle is not the 1998 was the point of it and what he was give, because the laureates are always asking, what did other laureates give? But with Amartya Sen, we had
we can tell the rest of the story later. Okay. Yeah. So, are we on? Yeah? Sure. Sorry for that. We had this fantastic idea of showing you some objects from the museum, but we had a slight problem with the sound. But I hope that we can come back and show you those artifacts later and tell the stories of the Nobel laureates that have given things to our museum. So this is an online seminar about crisis economy, and our next guest is actually my boss. He was formerly the director of Sweden's National Bank, and now he's the director of the Nobel Foundation. So give a warm hand to Lars Heikensten.
Hey, Hey. Hello.
How are you?
Fine.
Yeah. And you know all these speakers, and you also care very much about teachers.
Yes.
Why do you think teachers are important?
Well, you know, my mother was a teacher and my father was a teacher. So,
Okay. Only because of that?
And my girlfriend is a teacher. So
Oh, yeah.
So-
Wonderful.
So no, but obviously the role of teachers is extremely important, and we have had problems in that field during recent decades. I think not only in Sweden but in many other countries, and we need here at the museums and more broadly with the Nobel Prize to do all we can, I think, to help strengthen the role of teachers in the world.
Yeah,
And by the way, that's always a matter which is brought up by Nobel laureates when you talk to them. They always talk about the role that teachers played for them.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard so many nice quotes from the Nobel laureates just about teachers. So as we heard also earlier today, teachers play a really important role also in economics. And but you have been involved in crisis management on a large scale before. What is particular with the crisis now compared with those crises before, like in the 90s or 2007 and so on? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, in the early 90s we had a very deep crisis in Sweden. And that crisis, as well as the international financial crisis 2007, 2009, was primarily, I would say, caused by economic factors. And in both cases, it had a lot to do with credit expansion in the period before. And the stories were somewhat different. In the Swedish case, it was a consequence of very much of deregulations combined with a fiscal or stabilization policy that couldn't keep the economy sort of in balance. During the international crisis, it was a period before there with very low interest rates for a long time, and also with lax, I would say, regulations in the world as a whole, in the financial market, in particular in the US and in Britain, where most of the financial markets are. And basically, the system imploded in both cases, and as John were talking about here, the important thing at the time was to avoid the economy going down even deeper. Now, as John laid out, I mean, we have a somewhat different story. We have something happening outside the economy that does have economic consequences.
And in your role, when you were the director of the Swedish National Bank, that must also have been a pedagogic challenge to explain things to the public. How did you do that? Because you were a very public person. Everybody knows you.
I should say that I was not in the central bank directly at these two crises.
No.
I was in the period in between the two crises. Having said that, I agree with you that it is extremely important with pedagogic work and to help people understand, and it's important that economists do that, and it's important that policymakers do that, and in the period when I was in the central bank, we went from being one of the more closed central banks to actually one of the world's most open central banks. And it had we did a lot of things, explaining policy, traveling in the country, participating in debates, inviting the labor unions for meetings, a lot of things during that period. And it had to do with the need at that time to make people accept the idea that we should have a low inflation and a stable economic development, and to really ingrain that thought into people. And I think that actually worked.
Yeah, but were everyone happy with that approach, or did you have to fight to...
No, I would say that, in general, people were happy when they were observing the central bank that this happened. I think that there was broad agreement. Within the institution, it was another thing. It was not so easy to turn the institution around. I mean, they like to be secretive.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
I mean, central bank is like that, as most people. You know, I see some of that in this place where I work right now also. So.
Yeah.
So if you don't, but I generally think, you know, open systems work better long term.
Yeah, I totally agree. And but if we move now to the present situation, what do you think would be the best things to do right now?
Well, it struck me when I listened to John and to Lena that most of the things they say I agree with, and that might be a message in itself. I think that many people believe that economists disagree about everything. But I think that economists actually agree on the overall frameworks, usually. Then, because they might have different hats and sit in different institutions and have their own favorites, as you say, you know, they, on specific things, they can disagree quite a bit. But the overall story here, I think, is that we need to do what we can to help people who are really risking to suffer in the present situation. You know, that's one thing. We need to avoid a deep downturn in the economy, as John said. I mean, and Lena was stressing the first aspect a lot. We need to avoid long-term damage in different ways. And I also think that it was important that John mentioned the need to come back to international cooperation. We've done pretty poorly there during the last decades, and for the survival of mankind, I would say, you know, I would be drastic there. I think it's really needed more international cooperation, and we all have to understand that that's absolutely essential. It's essential to deal with financial crisis. It's essential to deal with the pandemic. It's essential to deal with climate change, obviously. You know, so that's one thing. Then and I also liked when John was saying that you know, we shouldn't look at this as the occasion to work only for our old favorites, so to say. Because if there is disagreement, as I said before, it has very much to do with that you have, you know, the economists of the business community, they argue for lower taxes, as they always do. And the labor market organizations, they argue for higher unemployment compensation, as they always do. Having said that, I think that given that we now need more spending, it is of course useful if we can do that spending in a way which leads long term in a good direction. There I think we all agree that doing things on the environmental side is good as long as you do the right things. Because that is an area where we will need not only more investment, but we will need more investment there.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because also I know that the central bank should be independent towards the politicians. How is the balance between the politics and the central bank?
Well, you know, I mean, the central banks have a rather limited focus. It has to do with interest rates, credit expansion, and these things, and traditionally working only with interest rates, it is a pretty blunt kind of measure affecting the economy as a whole. Now, given that we knew that central banks were having problem focusing on stabilizing the economy when they were run by politicians, you had this legislation which made central banks more independent. I think it has become a little bit more complicated over the recent decade because central banks are now so hugely involved in the economy. So there is a question there. Practically, I didn't think it was much of a problem. I mean, you know, we could talk with the government, and we did talk with them, and we knew usually what they were planning about doing, and we could do what we needed to do. And precisely because we were independent, we could be quite relaxed, I felt. But there are difficult issues here now. Having to do with the way monetary policy has functioned. I'm not questioning, probably I would have tried to do roughly what they have been doing, but it does raise long-term issues, I think.
And now you've been the director for the Nobel Foundation for how many years is it? Is it like
9?
9 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the Nobel Prize, what role can the Nobel Prize play in society and like inspiring people?
We know that it does have a very strong position, and we know what it stands for. You know, for science, for knowledge, for peace, for the humanities. So of course, using that with rigor or carefully to try to encourage people to do good things and inspire people to work in these areas and for these values, I think is absolutely in line with what Alfred Nobel wanted to achieve with his will. And I think that, you know, you are doing that right now, I think.
Thank you. Lars Heikensten, give him a warm hand, and you will stay here.
Yeah.
Please, Lasse, stay on the stage,
Okay.
because now it's time for our final panel. So I would like to invite Lena and John and also my colleague Pontus up on stage. I hope we can stand here without coming too close to each other. You can spread out a little bit. Please. And my colleague Pontus here, he was trying to show you some objects from the museum, but we had some sound problems. But tell me, Pontus, what do you work with?
I'm a teacher at the high school here in Stockholm. That's what I do.
Yeah, and also you work here at the
Yes,
museum.
and I also work here at the museum, of course.
Yeah. So as a teacher, when you've been listening to these experts, what are your first thoughts about this?
Well, I think that one of the things that I try to do in the classroom is to tell this, I mean, to inspire some hope, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions that the students have, and when I listen to you, I think it inspires me some and gives me some hope that maybe there, of course we're in a bad crisis, but might be some way out of this, and that I think is important.
Yeah, it must be.
Yes.
Yeah, and so Lena, you were first out today. When you listen to the other speakers here today, what are your thoughts on how should, like, some thoughts about the things that John and Lasse had said?
No, but I agree with most that has been said. I don't think what we're saying is contradicting in any sense, but we're rather giving perhaps, at least John and I, two different perspectives on, whereas you talk more about the aggregate effects, and that might be more encouraging, I think, if you think about sort of the consequences for inequality. We might be more worried, I would say, that this could have a really long-lasting effects. But I don't think that we disagree in any sense.
So we have some questions from the teachers that have participating online. So I have a question from a teacher named Kumar from India, and he was really happy that you also mentioned India. And what do you think, compared between Sweden, that did not have such a huge lockdown, and India, that really had a huge lockdown? Can you say something about the economy in different countries? He wanted to know something more about that.
India is in a tougher position than Sweden, for sure. I think that the possibility of, you know, having large shares of the population working from home is much bigger here than it is in India. Of course, I know that India has a very active and big IT sector, and maybe there it works. But in general, it's a more tricky thing, so the kind of the trade-offs between saving lives and saving the economy is tougher in India, for sure, and you can also see it in the data that India has suffered more on in particular the economic side. So I have to say that I'm a little bit more worried about developing countries than I am about the developed world.
Thank you. I have another question here from a Swedish teacher called Britt-Marie, and she's asking, can you give me some advice on how to also give hope to my students in an economic crisis that very much affects young people? Would any of you answer that?
Yes, I think that we are doing surprisingly well, actually, at least in the Western world, and we have the means of making sure that this crisis is a temporary blow, but we can make sure that it doesn't become worse than it has to. It has to be a bit bad. But we can make sure that it doesn't, and we can also make sure that it doesn't have very long-run consequences. And so far, this has worked. I was very worried, and many of my colleagues, that the effect of the Corona crisis was going to be to kind of put the world into a really long depression. That didn't happen, and I think, and that was because of good policy, I would say. And so I think there is reasons to continue to be hopeful.
Yeah, Lena.
I also think that if you look at young workers in particular, because we often hear that youth unemployment rate is high and it's really high in Sweden and so on, but the research really shows that for sort of the average student or young person, unemployment is not that bad, because most young people do have very short unemployment episodes, and they have very low risk of really falling into long-term unemployment. Those who are at risk are those the smaller fraction of that group that experience difficulties already in high school, for example. So difficulties of obtaining the right qualifications. But I do think that
these problems we already had before, and of course they remain. They're not going to disappear.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, do you have any tips for the policymakers concerning these issues with the students that have problems already in school, and they are facing far worse futures maybe than the average student? This is maybe not your expertise.
Well, I think that if we focus on the high school system, we know that there are several programs, in particular the vocational programs, that lead to very high employment probabilities, because there is a shortage in many sectors, and people are needed on the labor market, and once they complete a vocational high school program in those segments of the labor market, they do find employment. So I think encouraging people to sort of go into the right programs where there is actually a need for labor is something that could be done more, I think, in terms of the sort of more disadvantaged groups.
And an interesting finding there that people like you have found is that in the Western world, and also in Sweden, there is not the tendency that the jobs that do not require kind of a very high education, that they disappear. It's rather the contrary, that these kinds of work, they don't have to be easy, but they don't require a long education. They, if anything, seem to grow. On
the individual level, it's a little bit like you said. I mean, try to use this time as well as you can.
Yeah.
That is important. Education matters, and if you do it in the right in terms of where people are needed sectors, your chance of getting a job is pretty good. May I also say that I also think that the perspective you brought in when you said that many of us thought that this would get worse than it has is quite important. It could easily have gone substantially worse, and it's to me it's also surprising that the economics of this has functioned as well as it has.
Yeah, that's interesting. Pontus, you work on a daily basis meeting students in high school. What are their worries about this crisis? What do they have expectations?
Actually, I don't think they think too much about the economy, but because depends also on which school I work in, of course. And I think that my students, most of them, doesn't have, at least not yet, suffered the consequences yet. So they're very worried about the pandemic and to not sit together and wash their hands and stuff like that. But I don't think yet that they are talking too much about the economic consequences. But also I have, like, the students that I have 2 more years to study. So I guess for them 2 years is like a lifetime. So.
But you're also in charge of the economy prize here at the museum, how to communicate about the prize and so on. So what do you think is the hardest thing to explain to students about what they have told us here today? Is something that you want to ask the panel in order to help teachers explain what we just heard?
Yeah, I think when we talk about the economic prize here at the museum, we all try to find the most common things that can work in a larger story, so to speak. So I think that it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about that most the laureates, not the laureates, but scientists doesn't agree on the broader issues. That's interesting, I think. And we used to talk about, just to simplify the whole thing, we talk about Keynes and we talk about Friedman and try to create some tension among those, between those kind of ways to look at the economy. Do you think there is?
You know, I think, for example, when it comes to that, I mean, obviously, those 2 individuals that you are now mentioning stood for quite different things.
Yeah.
But when I was dealing with economic policy in practical terms, I felt that there was pretty much a clear consensus on how to deal with this. You know, I think people who were previously really Keynesians all the way, I mean, they've been influenced by some of the market thinking, but the other way around also.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree?
I certainly agree with that. That there is a lot of consensus that we can build on. Yeah. And what people maybe don't understand is that in the kind of discussion between academics and in research seminars, we always attack each other. If you come and give a seminar, I'm going to say, no, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And that's how it works.
That's why I hesitate to go.
But there is a lot of common ground when it comes to policy. But so you shouldn't take kind of the sometimes heated discussion between academics when they talk to each other as a signal that they don't agree on anything. And we have seen it a lot among epidemiologists now during the crisis. They of course agree on a lot of things, but some of the policy conclusions they don't. And it's because kind of their discussion, their academic discussion has come out to the newspapers.
And for better or worse, I mean, that's the way that media functions. They like to have the extreme opinions. They don't, you know, you don't end up in television if you always tell the consensus. Then they call someone else who is prepared to say something drastic.
Yeah, exactly. I was also thinking about climate change and the discussions that some people want to polarize, but scientists agree it is made by humans. So and connected to that, I wanted also to ask you about like the sustainability in issues and industries dying for good reasons. And if you were talking about that, like museums like ours has also, of course, lost many visitors, and that's not because it's a bad thing, but also are we protecting the aeroplanes and coal mines or things that should maybe go under?
Well, first thing I want to say that I sometimes ago, recently, I learned a fancy word, namely chronocentrism, and that is that you think that the time you are living in is the most important. So we are now at kind of, we have to go left or right, and this is a very important time, and everything is going to change. And people have believed that forever. And in particular, if you see some signs in the sky, like a solar eclipse or a virus coming, then they say that after this, everything is going to be different. So I think there is a tendency that we think that when the corona crisis is over, everything is going to be different. And I don't think that's right. Some things are going to be different, but most is not. So we shouldn't kind of exaggerate the consequences. I'm sure that this museum will be visited afterwards too. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing is that I think that the structural change that is necessary for our societies to be sustainable is best done in an orderly way. So I don't think that now is a good time to make 100,000 Polish coal miners unemployed. It's better to do that gradually afterwards. So then, you can think about some particular firms maybe should be saved SAS or not. But in general, I don't think that we should kind of take the advantage of doing like a change of society now. That's gonna backfire, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
And that I think, I noticed that you said that, and on that one, there are differences between economists. I tend to agree with you. But I hear quite a few people who are extremely worried that too much is done and that they're going to lock resources in. So far, I wouldn't be particularly worried. But of course, in the long run, we need to be open for change, and we need to change some of the policy measures gradually.
But you also have to bear in mind, that would be a huge utility loss for people if we just let, I still think that after this pandemic, people want to go to the museum. They might want to travel by airplane, and people have a willingness to do that and to pay for that. So I think that since the crisis is not caused by sort of a malfunctioning of these industries, but rather by something else, I don't think either that it's a good idea to just let things disappear.
But may I add one thing on this idea of, to what extent economists agree and disagree and so on. When you bring up the distribution questions, I certainly agree with you, but my worry is not that we cannot do something about it. My worry is that we will not do anything about it. Because during the last decades we have politically don't put much priority on dealing with these issues. And I'm quite worried that as a consequence of that, not because we couldn't do it, but because we will not do it, you will be right. We will have a larger group of people than we had when the crisis came who are in a bad situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Typically we have a conflict of interest. So, there is pros and cons of different policies. Here, I don't think it's like that. So the thing, if we kind of make sure that we don't get too much inequality by helping those that are particularly affected during the crisis, that's good for everything. It reduces the risk of us going down the drain with the economy. It reduces the risk that we get long-run damages to the economy. So kind of now it's complementarity. We can, so it's easier to do these things now, I think.
I think this is a really interesting discussion, and I think we could continue all evening, but that must be the last word from the panel. So thank you so much. Give a warm hand to all of them. You can. Okay, I think we are going to make another try with Pontus showing some of the objects. So he will be running to the other side of the museum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our next teachers seminar, because usually at this time of year we gather teachers from all over the world who would come here, fly here, from Colombia, from the US, from France, from Bangladesh, from Myanmar. It's fantastic, and we gather all these teachers here for the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit. This year, everything is different, of course, and that's why we developed this format that everybody can participate in. So we're going to do a smaller version of the Teacher Summit, because the Teacher Summit is a conference that is 4 days for teachers, and it's always a Nobel laureate participating. And this year we have the theme Migration and Movements, and you can all participate in that on 9th of October. Okay, so now it's time for Pontus showing some of the museum's treasures.
So, welcome to another part of the museum, and this is what we call the gallery. And as you can see, there's a lot of artifacts or objects, and these are objects from Nobel laureates. And every year, 4 days before the prize ceremony, the 10th of December, on Alfred's death day, the laureates come here to Stockholm, and the first thing they do is come to the museum. And we close the museum, and we only invite the laureates and their families, and we, I shouldn't say we, but the Nobel Foundation invites them to what they call a get-together. And this is a time for the laureates under easy form, so to speak, to hang out and talk to each other, because they are gonna have 4 days that is really with a tight schedule, and they will do a lot of things together, and they have never met most of the time. So the physics laureates have not spoken to the literature laureate, for example. So they, during this get-together, they eat lunch, and they talk and discuss and meet each other. And also, the Nobel Foundation goes through the week, what's going to happen, and they talk a little bit about the prize ceremony and how the banquet will work and stuff like that. And it's kind of course, when you work here, it's cool to see all the laureates, and you can also see that they're all most of the time they are very very nervous, and they talk a little bit or ask a lot of questions about the prize ceremony, and you can see that this is something that most of the time this is a very important day for them. So also when they are here, we ask them to bring some artifacts to the museum and tell a story about that artifact that we can show, so that we can show the public these things. So I will talk a little bit about some of these artifacts, and I will start with this one, the bicycle. This bicycle is an artifact that we got from Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen was the economics prize laureate for 1998, and the museum opened in 2001. So Amartya Sen wondered a lot about what object he should give us, and he was a bit confounded. And the laureates always are very much interested in what other laureates have given, so they can have some clue what to give themselves. So Amartya Sen was asking us, should I give you my computer? That's important for my work, but it's not kind of fun. Or should I send you some paper and pencils? And then he got back to us and he said, I have an idea. I will give you my bicycle. And a bicycle is not the most common object in scientific work, but he explained to us that in the attic at his mother's house in Bengal, he had his old bicycle, and he used it very much in the beginning of his science studies. So what he did was he was working at the university near his hometown, and he hired an assistant because he was interested in the weight of newborn babies, girls and boys. So he hired an assistant to go around in the villages around the university and weight boys and girls. And what happened was that the boys and girls, the newborn babies, didn't like the assistant, so they bit him a lot, and he quit. So Amartya Sen took his bicycle and rode around the countryside outside of the university and collected information, weighing boys and girls, and he did that every third month and collected these data. And then he, of course, made some analysis of this data, and what he found out was that there's some gender aspects to poverty as well, because the boys and girls didn't receive as much food, and the families, most of the families, fed the boys before they fed the girls, and this had implications, of course, for the larger society and the larger economy in these societies. So, and also I have another object here. We have these books here. These are from the most recent economics laureates, Esther Duflo, and these are books from learning organization in India called Pratham, and these books were handed out to teachers, and I think Annika talked about this initiative before, and teaching at the right level is the program that Pratham is working with, and they are giving books to teachers, and they have reached over 1 million students, and it has severely increased the learning outcomes in the societies that have been working with Pratham. So, thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back. This is from the Nobel Prize Museum in Stockholm, and my colleague Pontus just showed you some of his favorite objects related to the economics prize. So, these online seminars is a new format that we are trying out for teachers all over the world that can follow us online. And our next seminar is 9th of October. It's the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit, and we have a Nobel laureate present here at the museum, and some really fantastic experts and scientists and engaged teachers. And the theme for that event will be migration and movements. And we're going to talk about how refugee kids can cope with schools, and how we receive kids that have seek refuge in our countries, and what challenges that might be, but also on a higher level for the world, what it means, and also how we can build strong movements for peace, because 9th of October is actually the day that we announce who will get the 2020 year's Peace Prize. So by then, we'll know who it will be. We'll find out that exact day. So please join us for that event too. And until then, have a great week, and I'll see you soon again. Thank you so much for today.